Britain captured the escape plan before Japan's trapped army began to move. In July 1945, thousands of Japanese soldiers were still ordered toward the flooded Sittang River. If the route had been exposed, why did the breakout continue, and how much could the defenders exploit that knowledge? That question began in the rain-soaked Pegu Yomas, where a Gurkha patrol encountered a small Japanese detachment. Inside a dispatch bag recovered afterward were the 28th Army's routes, crossing points, unit assignments, and timetable. British commanders already expected a breakout because the Japanese position in the Pegu Yomas could not last. They still lacked the routes, the division of the columns, and the departure time. The papers supplied all three. Before the answer becomes clear, decide what Sakurai should have done: attempt the river crossing, or leave his army in the hills. Share your choice. The Sittang Valley covered a long front, the monsoon limited movement on both sides, and the Japanese still had thousands of armed men. But General Frank Messervy, commanding British IV Corps, no longer had to prepare for every possible route with the same urgency. He could move troops toward the places the documents identified, register artillery on likely crossings, and arrange air support around the roads and embankments the Japanese would need to use. Inside the mountains, Sakurai's soldiers continued preparing, without knowing that the plan had been compromised. Yet the captured papers were only part of their danger. Before British guns opened fire, the ground between the hills and the river would begin breaking the columns apart. That problem had been taking shape since Japan's position in Burma began to collapse. Japan had conquered Burma in 1942. Rangoon fell in March, followed by a long Allied retreat through the Central Plains toward India. British and Indian forces lost equipment, transport, and confidence. Thousands of civilians joined the withdrawal, and the monsoon turned the northern roads into a route of exhaustion and disease. 3 years later, the military balance had changed. General William Slim's 14th Army had rebuilt its supply system and learned how to hold positions even when Japanese troops moved around them. Air transport carried ammunition and food into isolated defensive areas. Malaria prevention was enforced because sickness had once removed more men from service than combat. The army itself was multinational, though it fought under British command. Indian formations provided most of the manpower. Gurkha battalions served across the front, along with British and African units. By 1945, these troops had accumulated years of experience in terrain that had once seemed to favor the Japanese. The turning point came during the Japanese offensives against Imphal and Kohima in 1944. Those attacks failed after Japanese supply lines broke down. Units that had entered India with limited reserves were forced back into Burma while disease and hunger destroyed their strength. The Allied advance followed. Meiktila fell, Mandalay was lost, and Japanese communications across central Burma began to fail. When Rangoon returned to Allied control in early May 1945, the main Japanese formations tried to withdraw east toward Thailand. The 28th Army could not follow the same route. Sakurai's force had retreated from western Burma and entered the Pegu Yomas, a belt of forested hills lying between the Irrawaddy Valley and the Sittang. The hills concealed the army from aircraft, but concealment did not solve its immediate problems. Food was running out. Medical supplies were almost gone. Cholera and dysentery spread through units already weakened by months of retreat. The rains damaged tracks and made the movement of heavy equipment increasingly difficult. Estimates vary, but roughly 18,000 to 20,000 men may have been trapped in and around the hills. That figure included remnants of the 54th and 55th Divisions, naval personnel, construction units, and mixed formations assembled from troops who had lost contact with their original commands. The total did not represent an army ready for a normal offensive. Many soldiers were ill. Others could march only slowly, and some could not move without help. Staying in the Pegu Yomas offered no workable solution. The mountains could not feed so many men, and Allied troops controlled the country to the west. The only exit led east, across flooded fields and over the Sittang. That river already carried a British memory from 1942. The bridge demolition and the troops it stranded deserve their own episode. For now, remember the 17th Indian Division, because it would return here under very different conditions. The river was already swollen by the monsoon. Boats were scarce, regular crossing sites were watched, and the approaches lay across open agricultural land. Even so, the Japanese command ordered a breakout. Sakurai's army was to leave the hills in several columns, cross the Sittang, and continue toward the Tenasserim region and Thailand. A separate operation by the Japanese 33rd Army was meant to support the movement. Its troops would attack farther south, near the Sittang Bend, and pull Allied attention away from the real crossing routes. The plan depended on timing. It also depended on the defenders remaining uncertain. The captured dispatch bag removed much of that uncertainty. Mesavy could not place a continuous line of infantry along more than 100 miles of valley. Instead, IV Corps used the information to build a defense around the ground the Japanese were most likely to cross. The 17th Indian Division occupied a central position near the expected routes, while other Indian Army brigades reinforced road and rail crossings farther north. Gurkha patrols watched the exits from the hills and reported movement as soon as columns appeared. The landscape narrowed the Japanese options. Between the Pegu Yomas and the Sittang lay rice fields, drainage channels, villages, roads, and raised embankments. Under monsoon conditions, much of the lower ground was flooded. A marching column could leave a road to avoid a defended point, but the alternative might be deeper water, slower progress, and loss of direction. British artillery officers studied the likely passages and registered their guns before the main movement began. Once observers detected Japanese troops, the batteries would not need to begin by searching for the range. Fire could be placed on known road junctions, embankments, and crossing points, then adjusted as the columns changed direction. The defenders now knew the routes. Air support was waiting, and the next Japanese order would remove the one tool that might have warned the columns that the plan had failed. The Royal Air Force prepared, standing patrols linked to controllers on the ground. Bombers could be directed toward troop concentrations or river craft when weather allowed. Low cloud reduced visibility, but the Japanese had no comparable air cover. Radio use was restricted after the troops left the mountains, and firearms were to be avoided unless necessary. In other circumstances, those instructions might have helped them pass through an Allied screen. Here they made coordination harder. A column delayed by floodwater or gunfire could not easily report its position, while nearby units might continue toward a route already under observation. The supporting attack in the south then began too early. During the first week of July, elements of the 33rd Army struck Allied positions around the Sittang Bend. The force was too weak to produce a major breakthrough, and the attack did not coincide with Sakurai's movement from the Pegu Yomas. The result was the opposite of what the Japanese command needed. Instead of drawing troops away at the decisive moment, the attack confirmed that the captured plan was still being followed. British and Indian units contained the assault with artillery and air support. When the fighting subsided, the main body of the 28th Army was still inside the hills. That delay gave Mesavy more time to strengthen the threatened sectors. The defense did not rely on one fixed line. Patrols and forward positions provided warning. Stronger units covered the roads, railway crossings, and the firmer strips of ground that remained usable. Artillery stood behind them, while aircraft could be called toward movement beyond the immediate view of the infantry. This arrangement mattered because the Japanese advance could not remain synchronized for long. Columns leaving the mountains at different points had to cross flooded ground, reach the same general line of roads and embankments, and then find enough rafts or boats to pass the river. A unit that fell behind might arrive after another group had already exposed the route. By the middle of July, Japanese columns began moving east. Men left the forested slopes and entered fields where water stood above the knee in many places and rose higher in depressions. Guides struggled to keep direction in rain and darkness. Heavy weapons and other equipment were abandoned when exhausted soldiers could no longer carry them. The plan divided the army among several routes to reduce congestion, but separation brought another risk. Units lost contact, timetables slipped. Men who could not keep pace were left behind, and small groups began to move independently. The defenders did not need to search every flooded field. They concentrated on the places where large bodies of men would eventually have to emerge. Near Penwegan, troops from the 17th and 19th Indian Divisions blocked one of the important approaches. Elements of the Japanese 55th Division tried to force a passage and failed. Other groups moved away from the defended points, only to enter areas covered by artillery observers or aircraft. The battle spread across a broad section of the valley. There was no single moment when the whole Japanese army attacked. Columns appeared separately, sometimes at night and sometimes after long delays. One group might reach a road under fire, while another was still struggling through the fields several miles behind it. That fragmentation allowed the defenders to shift fire from one target to the next. Artillery caused much of the damage. The Japanese had little opportunity to dig into flooded ground, and men crowded onto embankments because those routes offered firmer footing. The same embankments were easy to identify and had already been included in British fire plans. Forward observers sent corrections as the Japanese moved. Aircraft occasionally located troops hidden from ground positions, and the information could be passed to the guns. A column that escaped one strike could find the next section of its route covered before it arrived. The Royal Air Force flew in poor weather whenever conditions permitted. Spitfires and Thunderbolts attacked troop concentrations, bamboo rafts, and the limited river craft available. During the wider fighting around the Sittang, Allied aircraft flew several thousand sorties and dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. Those figures describe the scale of the air effort, but the immediate effect was more practical. Japanese commanders could not move large groups in daylight without risking detection. If they waited for darkness, they lost time and faced the river with even less visibility. There was no safe schedule left. The air attacks were most effective when they worked with ground observers and artillery. A pilot could report movement beyond an infantry position. Guns could then engage the route after the aircraft had turned away. The system did not operate perfectly in monsoon weather, yet it remained far more responsive than anything available to Sakurai's force. For the men crossing the valley, physical exhaustion became as dangerous as enemy fire. Wet clothing never dried. Disease spread among tightly packed troops. Food was unevenly distributed once units lost contact, and wounded men could not be evacuated in any organized way. Some columns still reached the Sittang. The river presented a new problem. It was wider and faster than it would have been during the dry season, and there were too few boats for the number of men arriving on the western bank. Soldiers built bamboo rafts or used improvised floats, but these carried only small groups and took time to assemble. Daylight exposed the crossing sites to aircraft and artillery. Darkness concealed the men from the air, but it also hid the strength of the current. Rafts broke apart. Soldiers who had already marched for days through floodwater entered the river with little strength remaining. Some drowned within sight of the far bank. Not every Japanese casualty was caused by the river, and the battle was not simply a mass drowning. Many troops had been killed or disabled before they reached the water. Others died from disease during the movement or were attacked after crossing. The Sittang's importance was that it prevented scattered local successes from becoming an organized escape. The eastern bank was not secure. Karen guerrillas and other local forces operated along the routes toward southeastern Burma. Survivors who crossed in small groups still had to move through country where Japanese control had largely collapsed. The Japanese 15th Army attempted to help some of the troops who reached the eastern side, but it could not restore the operation. By the end of July, the main breakout had disintegrated. The casualty totals remain uncertain. British and Indian forces lost about 96 men killed and more than 300 wounded. Japanese losses were far higher. Some accounts place the dead above 10,000, while broader estimates of killed, wounded, missing, and captured rise to roughly 13,000. These figures are difficult to reconcile because the 28th Army had already been weakened before the breakout. Men died from disease in the hills and during the march. Drownings were not always recorded, and some groups continued moving after the main battle had ended. What can be stated with confidence is that only a fraction of the trapped force crossed the Sittang in a condition to continue toward Thailand. The captured plan was important, but it was not the only cause of the disaster. Sakurai's army began the operation short of food, medicine, transport, and effective air support. The monsoon forced its columns toward a limited number of usable routes. Allied troops had working communications, prepared artillery positions, and aircraft available to strike movement in the open. The documents allowed Mesavi to bring those advantages together before the Japanese appeared. Without the papers, the British-led forces would probably still have opposed an eastward breakout. Their commanders already understood the general direction in which the Japanese had to move. The difference was precision. Units could be reinforced before contact, artillery could be registered in advance, and aircraft could be held near the most likely targets. The dispatch bag turned a broad expectation into a usable operational picture. The outcome also revealed how far the Burma campaign had moved from the conditions of 1942. The earlier reference to 1942 now becomes important. The Sittang Bridge was demolished, while part of the 17th Indian Division remained on the eastern side. Many soldiers escaped by swimming, but their vehicles, guns, and supplies were lost. The decision weakened the defense of southern Burma and became one of the retreat's most disputed episodes. In 1945, the same division returned within a different army. Its supply system worked, its officers could call on artillery and aircraft, and its troops no longer abandoned a position simply because the enemy moved around it. This time, the men approaching the river from the west were Japanese. The river itself had not chosen a side. The balance around it had changed through logistics, intelligence, communications, and control of the air. Japan surrendered in August 1945, only weeks after the fighting. The battle therefore received little attention beyond the Burma theater. News from the Pacific soon centered on the atomic bombings and the final surrender, while the destruction of a retreating army in flooded fields remained a distant event. For the troops at the Sittang, there was nothing distant about it. Indian infantry held road positions surrounded by water. Gurkha patrols moved through the hill exits, artillery observers watched the embankments, and air crews searched beneath low cloud for columns still trying to reach the river. The Japanese continued, because remaining in the Pegu Yomas meant the gradual collapse of the army. Their route east offered the only remaining chance, even after the conditions needed for success had disappeared. The Battle of the Sittang Bend became one of the final major land engagements fought by Western Allied forces against Japan. It destroyed the 28th Army's attempt to escape as an organized formation and removed one of the last substantial Japanese forces operating west of the river. What made the battle decisive was not the river alone and not the captured papers alone. The documents showed the defenders where the pressure would come. The flooded terrain narrowed the routes. Artillery and aircraft then struck troops who had little room to change direction. When Sakurai's columns finally came out of the Pegu Yomas, the crossing ahead was already dangerous. More importantly, the army waiting beside it knew where they were going.